everybody. Wanted to make a long-promised short video on the history of Algeria. When I say short, I think it will be pretty short. Um, I'd be fooling no one if I tried to claim that I was the expert on the history of Algeria, although I have had a fun time going down rabbit holes, getting to know a little better than I did before, that is for sure. But this is just a very brief overview, as you guys will see, of Algeria, so you have a little bit of ability to put the Battle for Algiers, the movie, in a little bit of context. And so I hope this is helpful. And this should not be a long video, I think. But grab a pen and paper, and this will be helpful to you guys as you get ready to watch the movie for a little bit of background. So Algeria does have a very long history, and the Battle of Algiers is just part of that. The movie has become a classic, as you guys probably are aware or will be aware. Not just about Algeria, of course, but the much larger struggle. It's also symbolic because the themes of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism that you'll see in the movie, the cinematography, all that has made it a classic of the era and a rallying cry, and it still has impact today. It's still considered one of the great classics of filmmaking, and also of a time in which a colonized people is throwing off their colonizer. And then you can see on the screenshot Battle of Algiers there on the left, and then also the film director, the Italian director. And I'm a little bit afraid to try pronunciation on his last name, so maybe I'll let you read it. And a screenshot, an iconic screenshot from the film itself, which you guys will be watching shortly. Now, the movie is going to be focused on the Battle for Algiers, and when you guys watch the movie, technically, militarily, I suppose the French are going to win the Battle of Algiers, and they're going to crush the FLN, but the French are going to lose the war. So while maybe technically, in a limited sense, they're able to crush the FLN in the city of Algeria itself, but out in the countryside, they are going to fail, and eventually, for a variety of reasons, the French will realize it is a lost cause, and they're going to give up and they're going to leave. So despite maybe the technical victory, it's a strategic defeat for the French, and ultimately the Algerian population is going to be able to kick the French colonization powers out of Algeria. So just a brief overview here, and let me make it a little smart for you guys. There's modern day Algeria. A lot of Algeria, as you guys can imagine, is desert. But there are some very productive areas along the coast. You guys see here on the geographic map, even in central Algeria, there are some places where agriculture is possible. Also, Algeria is a quite large country, and the areas in the coast have a more Mediterranean climate, which you and I are more familiar with, because California, to some degree, has a Mediterranean climate. So it's a little bit like Algeria. You have some very good agriculture areas in parts of Algeria. And then, of course, you have large parts of Algeria that are desert. So it's really a mixed bag in Algeria. I want to give you guys some possible sources if you guys, on your own, maybe after the semester, found something about Algeria that fascinates you. Here's some good choices. So there's not a lot of general histories of Algeria. The best I found is the History of Algeria by James McDougall. Looks like a good choice. If you're interested in the conflict and the war itself, in this case, the war against the French, the Savage War of Peace, Algeria 54 to 62 by Alistair Horn would be a good choice in the middle. And then something much more personal, which might be a good read, with Inside the Battle of Algiers by Zohar Drif. That's translated out of the French. But that's more of a first-person account of the Battle of Algiers. Then on the left, the Memoirs of Algeria would be a good choice too. It'll get you into more of the social, class, religious, ethnic aspect to the conflict. In the middle, you can see The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. That's a classic book, as he's looking at the Algerian revolt against the French. That's also a period piece, because when that came out, this was a very influential book in many of the leftist movements around the world trying to end colonialism, imperialism. So that book can be read for both of those, both as an account of the Algerian revolt, but also of the larger perception of the struggle and the importance of the struggle and the symbolism of the struggle for the larger third world or parts of the world that have been colonized And finally, the book on the right by Martin Evans, Algeria, another look at the war with the French. Now, of course, there's more to the story of Algeria. That's just a brief overview of some books that might be helpful to you guys. Okay, so again, we're going to go through a high-speed walk down the past of Algeria. So Algeria does have a very long history and a complicated history in that it's tied into many of the larger world struggles taking place in Africa and in the Mediterranean too. And that takes us to ancient Namibia. And you can see the dates there from 202 BC to 25 BC. By the way, Algerian history goes back even farther than that, but this is where we're going to pick up. So Namibia is going to play a role in the Roman world, and in this case, these independent kingdoms, in this case, Kingdom of Namibia, which was not controlled by the Romans, but influenced by both Roman or Carthaginian culture, also the Berber culture, and this kind of, which will be a lot of Algerian history, by the way, a variety of different ethnic groups being grouped together in kingdoms of various sizes. And in this case, you can see the Median ruler there, the Median cavalry, which is one of the best of the ancient world. And we'll see that later on in Algerian history too. The fantastic mobile fighters, which is the Algerian cavalry. Eventually, the Romans are going to conquer Namibia, and see from 25 BC all the way to 430, 440s when Roman control is going to break down. But Algeria will be part of the Roman Empire, and even today there are outstanding Roman ruins in parts of Algeria and North Africa in general. So, and it's just the reason why this is important. It signifies Algeria is in some ways a borderland between what we today think of Europe, what we think of Africa and sub-Saharan Africa. Algeria for a long time has been in that border region affected by events, peoples, empires, kingdoms, trade, etc., from both the Mediterranean world and above into what they would be Europe, and then in the African continent and farther south in Africa as well too. After the Roman period, the Vandals and Alans and the barbarian migrations would briefly, relatively briefly, control what today would be Algeria. But they'll be replaced by the Byzantine Empire. Again, a relatively quite brief, but Byzantiums will eventually kick out the Alans and Vandals, and the Byzantiums would, for a relatively brief time, control what today would be Algeria. As I promised, this will be relatively short. And that takes us on to the Islamic dynasties and kingdoms that come with the dramatic conquest of much of the Middle East and North Africa into Spain of the Islamic empires. And there's a whole series of these. So in this very brief lecture, I'm not going to delineate all of them because it's a long list. And the kingdoms are steadily changing. So I'll just give you an overview from the 660s to 830. There's a whole succession of various kings. At times, modern-day Algeria will be part of larger empires. At times, it will be part of the smaller kingdoms. And it changes steadily. So we're going to leave it at that very brief general description of a whole series of kingdoms control what today would be Algeria. Now, ultimately, getting a little closer in time, something you perhaps recognize is the Ottomans are eventually going to conquer what today would be the northern coast of Algeria as well, too. Now, the Ottoman control oftentimes was relatively light. And so, yes, technically part of the Ottoman Empire, but Ottoman control would be probably more in name than in fact, I suppose, in many cases. So you might have a certain grudging acceptance of, at least in theory, Ottoman control, but in reality, fairly independent states, which in today would be in the area today of Algeria. And there's even an overlay between U.S. history and Algeria, and of course not just Algeria, but Tunisia and other places too. And that is with the Barbary Corsairs, which that might be the first thing that kind of rings a bell for you guys talking about Algeria. So Barbary Corsairs control not just Algeria, by the way, but other areas, for example, Tunisia and the area too, and probably into Morocco as well. But The Barbary Corsairs are extremely talented Algerian, and other states too, but mariners slash pirates who build an economy based on piracy, slaves, and protection payments. And they're going to do a quite brisk business in this piracy for a very long period of time. Even, by the way, prior to the Ottoman conquest of North Africa, there were already early versions of this. So piracy was inbuilt in this region of North Africa, boy, probably 800 years, a very long period of time, of varying degrees of intensity. But the locals, being fantastic mariners, are able to prey on shipping that is in the Mediterranean. What you guys see in front of you, by the way, is one of the most important of the Ottoman admirals, but he's going to be from the area which today would be Algeria, and many is called it home, even though he's not going to die there because he's working for the Ottomans. But that would be Barbarossa. Perhaps you recognize that name. So that's Barbarossa there. In this case, Hadrian Barbarossa. And you see a modern-day portrait of him there on the left, and then a more contemporary portrait in the middle, showing him holding a trident. This is by a European artist, symbolizing his mastery of sea power. And on the right, the image shows Barbary Corsairs selling slaves to, in this case, some Catholic friars who come to try to win their release. And again, that's because part of piracy was both obviously seize a ship, but the ship includes all its human cargo, who would be then enslaved and perhaps would be ransomed, ultimately sold back to their countries of birth or nationality, depending on what takes place, or used as a slave until they died. There's a depiction of the 17th century of an Algerian slave market. Again, this is fruits of piracy. The Barbary Corsairs were very talented mariners and frequently won battles in their attempts, and were very difficult for the Europeans to deal with. A whole series of ongoing conflicts with the various European powers. I mentioned the protection racket because periodically the Europeans got sick and tired of dealing with them, and the way to deal with that was to pay them off. So it's kind of like the mafia coming by and saying, we don't want your restaurant to burn down. That is a Barbary Corsair, because they'll be happy to burn it down for you and take those people hostage as captives and slaves, or you can pay for protection so that fire doesn't happen. And that certainly is a Barbary Corsairs, and this is a depiction of Algeria there on the left, and various depictions of Barbary Corsairs ships out plying the Mediterranean looking for loot and ships. And moving rapidly, that's where we get to a little closer to the Battle of Algiers itself. So the French are going to ultimately progressively colonize what today was Algeria from 1830 all the way to 1962, when they eventually leave or forced out. So the French invasion began in 1830, but really it takes quite a few years because Algeria is not a small nation. It's a quite large region. So the French colonization, almost like waves lapping onto a shore, gradually over all those years, in this case 73 years, gradually assumed more and more and more of what today would be Algeria. The conflict was increasingly intense because the Algerians resisted quite fiercely from the beginning, both around Algeria and all the way to the rest of the conquest. Eventually, after suffering setbacks and struggling, the French adopted increasingly aggressive military tactics to finally suppress the Algerian resistance. General Bougard, don't quote me on that French pronunciation. I did take French in college, but not enough. Just enough to get myself in trouble. But that quote by him, who was brought in by the French late in the conflict to try to deal with the guerrilla tactics of the Algerian resistance fighters, will go on to say, I will enter into your mountains, I will burn your villages and your harvest, I will cut down your fruit trees. So, and he did. That was not an idle threat. The ultimate cost to Algerians in lives and lost production, not to mention the colonization and the loss of the best land and so forth that comes, is going to be very high, as you can imagine. The French justification for this invasion, and there's many, but the typical one is the French had a grain deal with the Algerian Dey. The Dey is the leader of Algiers. The French felt that he was not treating them as they thought right. The Dey was aggravated probably by French arrogance. So at one point, as you see depicted there on the left, in frustration, the Dey of Algiers, and that's Dey Hussein Pasha, grew frustrated and holding his fly whisk, or fan, whacked the French, I guess, ambassador to Algeria with it. The French felt insulted by that. French, for their own domestic reasons, wanted to have a foreign enterprise distract titanium from French troubles back home, and Algeria seemed to fit the bill. They had a bone to pick with them in any case, and also maybe wonderful distraction from France's internal struggles and political squabbles. And so this begins the French invasion, occupation, colonization of Algeria. That would be that event with the fly swatter 1827 will be the genesis of France's attempt to colonize Algeria, which they will. Depiction there, the French fleet arriving there off Algiers and beginning the bombardment of Algeria itself. Some depiction of the very intense fighting between the French military and the Algerians. The map in front of you is showing the gradual progression of the French colonization of Algeria. And the darker colors, obviously, that's farther back in time, and gradually they're going to colonize all of what today is Algeria. Now, as I mentioned before, the Algerians resisted strongly the entire of this, both in the city of Algiers itself when the French first invaded, and later on when the large Algerian military forces were defeated, the Algerians resorted to some very successful guerrilla tactics that worked for quite a while. The individual one is most associated with this Algerian resistance is a man named Emir al-Qadir. And we're going to talk about him later in the semester too in a very different context. But he was a Sufi Islamic scholar, highly educated, also a very talented military leader, and will successfully lead his Algerian irregular guerrilla forces against the French for quite a few years, causing the French a lot of headache. Eventually, he would be defeated because the French grew increasingly ruthless in their scorched earth tactics, and eventually were able to take away his hiding locations, terrorize villages and farms that supported him, and eventually he would be forced into surrendering. That's a photograph of me on the left. Actually, we know quite a bit about him. Again, we'll talk about him later in this semester. But the importance of him is he became a great symbol of an extremely well-educated, talented Algerian guerrilla fighter, but I mentioned him being a Sufi Islamic scholar. He is highly educated, very devout, and also remarkably, even the French would admit this, besides being an incredibly capable military guerrilla leader of the Algerian forces, and also quite successful in combining various Algerian tribal groups into a fighting force of resistance. But also he was known to be a very conscientious, honorable opponent, oftentimes treating the French casualties quite well. So the French grew, despite him being a very formidable opponent, grew to have deep respect for him as a soldier because of his high regard for the prisoners he took and well treatment of the French under his control. Now, he's a ferocious fighter. He will fight you. But when it came to oftentimes the darker parts of war, prisoners are killed or treated poorly, Emir Qadir is not doing that. In fact, he's doing the exact opposite. And we'll see that in much greater detail later in the semester, because we'll come back to Emir Qadir. On the right there, you see a current statue of him commemorating his resistance to the French, currently in Algiers today. But despite Emir Qadir and others' valiant efforts, the French would ultimately crush Algerian resistance and take control of Algeria. Now that takes us to, and again, I'm skipping over a lot, because gradually, despite the fact that the military conflict ended, that did not mean the Algerians themselves were okay with French colonization. By the way, when I say colonization, France, in many ways, considered Algeria to be not a colony in a sense. They consider it really part of France. And immigration to Algeria from France was quite large. A significant number of French citizens moved to Algeria and considered that home, and really, frankly, a part of France. Unlike most French colonies, where obviously it's clearly colonial, but for many French, they considered Algeria to be almost like home territory in their own mind. Now, the indigenous Algerians no doubt beg to differ on that perception, because the French took the best farmland, unsurprisingly, and the French are dominant in society, even though the French had perhaps a generalized vision that we're all going to be French Algerians, but not surprisingly, it's people of French ancestry from France who are at the top of this Algerian society. And the indigenous Algerian population, no doubt, resented that, and growing nationalism would begin to emerge, especially after World War II. The Algerian nationalism is growing increasingly more and more active, and ultimately it leads to Algerian War of Independence from 1954 to 62, of which the Battle of Algiers, the movie you guys are watching, plays a prominent role. So the Battle of Algiers took place from 1956 to 1957. As you guys see, the war actually would grind on for another 5 years. But unlike the Battle of Algiers, again, which although symbolically, unquestionably, an Algerian victory, militarily, I suppose it's a defeat. But as you guys know, these wars are a long game. Just like in the United States occupation, involvement in the Vietnam War, the United States in the Vietnam War technically on a numbers game won every major battle against the North Vietnamese or the Viet Cong in Vietnam. That may be all true, but the Vietnamese, as you guys know, and the Viet Cong were willing to fight longer, and eventually America begins to lose the will and abandons the war. So perhaps in many ways that's analogous to the French in Algeria, that they may win battles, and the French did win battles in this war, and France tried very hard to hold on to Algeria. Again, in the French mind, for some French, certainly they viewed Algeria really as a part of France. But clearly the indigenous Algerians did not view it that way, and ultimately the Algerians are going to prevail, as you see. We're almost at the end of this lecture. I just want to mention the last couple of things briefly. Algeria would see a succession of governments, although the group you guys see in the movie, which is the FLN, are going to triumph and kicking the French out, and they're going to be the ones who have been in power essentially since then. But it gets more complicated because Algeria was split among its own leaders over what their future should entail. And ultimately, tragically, it led to a very difficult time period, the Algerian Civil War of 1992 to 2002. 10 years of a very bloody internal conflict in Algeria, essentially between the FLN and a variety of Islamist insurgency groups that want a more directly Islamist government society in Algeria. Ultimately, after many years of savage fighting on both sides, the essentially FLN would triumph over the Islamists, probably because the Islamists of the two were the quickest to resort to wholesale atrocities, at least some units of these Islamist organizations, and that meant they oftentimes lost the sympathy of the typical Algerian. Didn't mean the typical Algerian was not deeply frustrated with some of the corruption issues with FLN, because they were, but these Islamist organizations developed reputations, some of them for extreme brutality towards civilians, and that eventually turned the tide in public opinion against them, whereas FLN still has, to some degree, the mandate of having a mandate or the legitimacy of having kicked the French out of Algeria. Eventually, that war would come to an end, again, with the FLN triumphing, the Islamist organizations being destroyed or driven underground and ceasing to exist as a fighting force. And Algeria has continued on to today. And Algeria is a relatively stable country. The FLN and its successors are still really in power, and I think that's enough of, I told you, short video. I think 20-some minutes is enough. A short little background to the classic movie you guys are getting ready to watch, which is The Battle of Algiers. I hope you guys enjoy that movie. It's wonderful and gives you a strong window into the Battle of Algiers, and also the symbolic appeal of this struggle for many of the people in the Middle East specifically, but other places in the world too, frankly, who saw the Algerian ultimate victory against the French as a rousing rejection of European imperialism, colonization, etc., and the emergence of a proud Algerian independent free state. So with that, we'll stop right there. So, all right, everybody, we'll see you guys in class. Take care, everybody.